can't tell you how much and how delighted I am not only to have you here, but more importantly to have John Corigliano with us. If you've had a chance to, any of you, read his biography, it is an amazing story, beginning obviously as a young child. His dad was concertmaster of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. That's kind of where his musical roots came. But I've read just a number of quotes, and I think you probably have read them as well, but the one to me, and just talking with John, he's kind of moving away from that, but he truly is the major symphonist, if you will, of the 20th century. I don't think there's any argument with that. His work with Chicago Symphony, Symphony 1, which is one of my favorites, and just amazing things. So we're truly lucky to have John here, and I can tell you a little bit of the background of what got him here originally. Many of you may know one of our alums, Peggy Monastra, who works at G. Sherman. And shortly after the storm last year, while we were preparing to come back for the second term after the hurricane, I called Peggy and I said, you know, it would really be wonderful if you could maybe help us with any of your artists that you have to come down to be with our students. I said it'll be very important for them to reconnect with this institution. And for many of you that are freshmen, you never really attended. You came for a day and left and were evacuated. So John graciously agreed to come. We couldn't quite work schedules in the spring. Things got a little hectic, and then we got that Spring 2 thing and all of that went on with that. So, happen as it may be, John was able to come down with the LPO to do the clarinet work that we're going to hear today with Simon Drucker from the New York Philharmonic. And the schedules worked out, so he has graciously agreed to be with us today. And so please welcome, truly an amazing person, John.
I hear there are a bunch of composers here. Which people are composers? Okay, great. Yes. Even if you're not a composer, you're a composer. That's great. I love talking to composers, especially because there are so many composers now, and they're all doing different things. It's not like it used to be many years ago where you kind of taught one way of writing music and thinking. Today, because of the internet and the availability of everything, a composer has complete access now. It's not like any other time. It's really hard to believe. There was a time when I was a young composer that you really couldn't hear anything but perhaps Stravinsky and Copland, but no other composers, because the record companies in those days only released the 5 major composers that were living, and all the rest were the regular repertoire. But you could listen to composers of your own age and all over the world. I was in China, in Beijing, and during a lecture like this, a woman raised her hand and said, I'm doing my doctoral thesis on your second symphony. And the symphony had not yet been recorded commercially and was not published. And yet, thanks to the internet, she had a score, she had a recording, and she did a doctoral thesis on it. So times have changed, and it's really very different for a composer. When I started, as I said, I was coming into it through a great love of Copland and Stravinsky and that whole world that then led to the Americana world that we all love so much. And then I changed, and not because I didn't like it, but I absorbed new things and became different. And about 1970s, mid-70s, I decided that I was very interested in trying to write a different way. Not that it would produce different music, but I wanted to think about a piece another way. And that was that it seemed to me that the most important part about a piece was the building of the architecture of the piece. That is, what happens in 30 minutes. That instead of writing a few bars of music and then saying, what does that need to be with, and writing a few more bars and perhaps another few bars, what would it be like for me to somehow plan a piece of 30-something minutes or an opera of 2.5 hours and actually build the piece first as if it were a building and then find the music for it. And I started doing that, and it became very interesting to me because I built this building, and you know, many people talk about music as architecture in the dimension of time. If you think of it that way, when we build a piece, there are things about architecture and about art and music that have very much the same thing. When you design a building, you want certain things to repeat, and you want other things to be different, and the scaling of that is what makes a great architect. If you look at the Capitol building in Washington, you're really seeing what we in music call ternary form. You're seeing A, the dome is B, and the return is to A. And that's the balance that makes that work. Well, we've been using traditional forms since Haydn developed them way back in the 1700s. And very often writing in those forms solves that problem. But to me, the most exciting part about a piece is what happens if you just say, I need to write a piece, and then you say, now what shape can this be? We also have to realize that today there are no rules, quite severely and importantly, no rules about composing. In the Baroque period, in the classical period, in the Romantic period, and even 12-tone music, they all have rules. And if you learn rules, you can start in composing. But today, I mean, quite honestly, I can say this is the beginning of a piece, or this is the beginning of a piece, or this is the beginning of a piece. Silence. All of those are correct. Nobody can say that's wrong. It's what you do with that that matters. So the way I write music, and I've been doing this for a while, is I try to pinpoint all the things that I want to happen and the reason I want to write that piece, and almost type it out and write it out and understand why I'm writing that piece. Then I build the whole shape of that piece. And then after it's built, I will show you what I mean in a few minutes. After it's built, then I look for the material for that building that I've already designed. I don't think you'd find an architect designing the cornice of a building without knowing what the building is. That comes later. And I don't think you'd find a sculptor sculpting out a finger and saying, I wonder who that's attached to, and then keep sculpting. They know what's inside that block through many sketches. And yet so often in music, we find that someone is composing a little part of something and then really doesn't know what's going to happen next. I try to answer those questions the best I can beforehand and actually draw it on pages of music or pages without, just pages like that, blank pages, where I will draw shapes and returns of ideas, etc. So this is how this piece got written. This clarinet concerto was written for 1977 premiere, so it was written during 1966. And the interesting thing about the piece for me, well, I had a lot of very strong emotions that made me want to do something special in this piece. The following emotions was first, actually. My father was the concertmaster, as was remarked, of the New York Philharmonic for my entire life. When I was a child, I used to watch him go to Carnegie Hall and play concertos and work with the orchestra, and met Toscanini and Bruno Walter and all those great conductors. As I grew up, I went on tour with the orchestra and actually knew them personally because my father was the concertmaster, so that I went on the European tour with them and knew the timpanists and who they were and what their friends were and who liked whom and who didn't like whom, etc., just like you do with people you know. And so then in 1976, I got this call commissioning me to write a piece for them. Now, I was a composer then. I had written music. I had sent it to the Philharmonic and other people, but the Philharmonic had never played a piece of mine. So to begin, it was very important to me that the orchestra I grew up with was playing this piece. My father, who had retired from the Philharmonic in the late 60s, died a year before, and when I got the commission, he had been dead less than a year, and I thought, I mean, writing a piece for the orchestra, not only I grew up with, but in a sense for my father, who was the concertmaster of that orchestra. Something has to happen to this piece that in some way lets me speak about that. And the soloist was Stanley Drucker. Many, many years earlier, when I was in high school, I took 2 clarinet lessons with Stanley, and then my clarinet was stolen out of my high school gym locker, and I wasn't very adventurous, so I never got a new one. But nevertheless, I always knew that Stanley Drucker, who became first clarinet of the New York Philharmonic at the age of 18, and is still the first clarinetist right now of the New York Philharmonic, playing just as amazingly, has done that for well over 50 years. He is the ultimate virtuoso. And the conductor was to be Leonard Bernstein. And that meant a lot to me, first of all, because I think Bernstein was such a great man. And I so admired his music and his conducting and his speaking to people. But practically speaking also, I worked with him for 13 years on the Young People's Concerts, this whole series on CBS television. You can now get video discs of. And I worked with him on the scripts, with him and Mary Rogers, Richard Rogers' daughter, and his assistant, and the director and his assistant. We worked on the scripts with him the week before the telecast, and then I worked with the cameras and camera shots during the telecasts, which were at a certain point live and then became taped later on. So I had all of these feelings of, what am I going to do with this piece, with all these people I care about, the loss of my father, the first piece played by the orchestra I grew up with, and Leonard Bernstein conducting it. And that was what I stewed around with for a while. And I came to some conclusions first, and this again is the big piece conclusion. I felt that the concerto had to have a central movement, and that central movement had to be an elegy in memory of my father. Now, since he was the concertmaster, I said to myself, what I really need is a very lyrical, almost desolate movement for personal reasons, and a movement in which the solo violin was very predominant. The concertmaster is the first violinist, and he plays all the solos. So in the second movement, there's an extended solo with the concertmaster playing, and then a duet with the solo clarinetist. And that was the first impulse I had. So now I knew I was going to have a slow movement that concerned the sense of loss of losing your father, and also the idea that the person who was playing in that seat was your father, because that's where he was all those years. The next thing was Stanley. Stanley was so famous as having the greatest fingers in the history of the instrument. He was a super virtuoso of virtuosi. And I said to myself, what would happen if I wrote him a movement that I entitled Cadenzas? And the movement is basically about the cadenza. And for those of you who are not familiar with the cadenza, it's a passage in the concerto in which the orchestra stops playing and the soloist plays and shows his or her virtuosity, and sometimes it's written down, and in the early days it used to be improvised, but it's a very free passage for the soloist to show what they can do. So I thought, what would happen if I had a piece in which the piece opened with a cadenza for the soloist, playing wildly and very softly, and then after that cadenza, the orchestra and the soloist played this kind of interlude leading to the second cadenza, which would be like the first cadenza, except when the first cadenza was all soft and very whispery, the second cadenza was wild and energetic. Then I said, I really don't have to leave the orchestra out of these cadenzas, but I don't want the soloist to be inhibited by having to even worry about the orchestra. So I developed a notation in this piece in which there are cues for the conductor to cue and wait for the soloist to do something and cue at the next one and cue at the next one. And percussionists and other instruments can come in on those cues, but the soloist doesn't have any beat time he has to worry about. He just plays. So that was the idea of the structure of that. Now I had the first movement, which would be these cadenzas. I had the second movement, which would be an elegy. And now in the final movement, this was a very interesting problem for me. I wanted to have, because I knew the Neo-Philharmonic, every single person in the orchestra play in the concerto. It's like a 104-piece orchestra. One doesn't tend to do that in a concerto because you'll swallow your soloist with too much sound. On the other hand, emotionally, I thought, I want everybody to play. And not only that, but I want every single person, including the string players, to play a little tiny solo at one point, even if it's one note, just because I know the orchestra. Now, this is an irrational decision. I just made this decision because I wanted to. It's kind of crazy. And I thought, well, okay, but I'm going to do it just because I feel that way about this orchestra, and it's my first with them ever. So I had to figure that out. I said, well, what I can do to be just a little more practical is take out, in terms of playing, some of the instruments. That is, not have everybody play through the whole concerto, but maybe save some of the players for the last 5 minutes, say, and then let them play so that everybody does play, but not through the entire 3 movements.